Hi, my name is Jan Wilczek from WolfSound.com. Welcome to WolfTalk, a podcast about audio programming. In this podcast, you will learn how to build your career in programming or research related to audio, meet programmers and researchers from all around the world, and learn about the intricacies of sound. Hi everyone, and welcome to the 23rd episode of the WolfTalk podcast. And today, as usual, I have a very special guest for you, namely Dave Rowland. Dave is a C++ programmer and an engineering manager from Great Britain who's working at Audio Squadron. He's an architect and the lead developer of Tracktion's DAW, so a digital audio workstation, which is called Waveform. He's also a very well-known audio developer conference speaker whose talk draw typically the majority of attendees at those conferences. Actually, at the last conferences, he got the biggest room and it was full with audio devs and the attendees. And I think in the next conference is going to double like this. And plus, everyone seems to be citing his talks, but more on this in the interview. So I think he's probably most famous for his real-time 101 talk he did with Fabian Wren-Giles. So Fabian was a guest on the show in podcast episode number 21. And another very famous talk by Dave is on juice value trees. But I guess that all of his talks are widely cited. So in the interview, we'll discuss story of Dave Rowland and the tools he's using in everyday work. We'll discuss how to learn audio programming. We'll discuss also audio software architecture, which, as you may imagine, is something very important if you're building a very complex application like a digital audio workstation. We'll discuss real-time programming. We'll discuss code optimizations in C++, and we'll discuss C++ on its own. We'll also mention a ton of resources on these topics, so be sure to tune in for those. Finally, we also discuss how to recharge after work and how to stay focused while you're working. As usual, the episode notes for this podcast episode are available online at dwolfsound.com/talk023. Once again, it's dwolfsound.com/talk023. And if you enjoy the podcast, if you like the podcast, then you can subscribe to the WolfSound channel on YouTube. If you want to support it, you can give a thumbs up to this video. You can leave an up to 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, in YouTube, you can suggest who would you like to see next as a guest on the show. And finally, before we jump into the interview, I'll just to briefly mention a resource that can help you become someone like Dave, an audio programmer, a fully fledged audio programmer. And it's my free audio plugin developer checklist that you can get at dwolfsound.com/checklist. And it lists every bit and piece of knowledge that I believe is necessary to become a full-fledged audio developer. And since audio programming is an area that encompasses a few different fields, I think this checklist is very valuable for someone new to this field. And frankly, that's the feedback I get from people who download the checklist, that it's exactly what they needed to start in audio programming. So grab it at dwolfsound.com/checklist. And now to the interview with Dave Rowland. Hi, Dave. Thanks for agreeing on this interview. Could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yep. Hello, everyone, and hello, Jan. I am Dave Rowland. I'm the CTO, group manager at Audio Squadron, which has two main brands called Tracktion, which makes the DAW Waveform and the open source Tracktion engine and a whole bunch of synthesizer plugins. And on the hardware side of the business, we have Prism Sound, which makes high quality audio interfaces and large channel converters for large studios and theaters and things like that.
Okay, nice. And could you share maybe how this whole huge programming journey started? Because you've been in this field for how many years? Like 14 already?
Yeah, something like that. I guess it depends, where do you define starting? I guess my paid job, it was probably about 15 years ago, something like that. But I sort of trickled into it.
Yeah, so how was the beginning? So were you playing some musical instrument?
Yeah, so when I was a teenager, I guess I came to music quite late. I started playing guitar when I was about 15 and just sort of fell in love with it, made a band with my friends. We weren't prolific or anything, but we just had lots of band practice, hanging out, listening to music, playing together, which was fun. And then that sort of influenced what I wanted to do at university. I was like, I don't want to go to university. I just want to make music, even though I was nowhere near good enough to actually do that. Luckily, my parents sort of said, okay, well, why don't you find a sort of engineering type music course? Because I was quite good at maths and physics. So they were like, why don't you kind of combine that kind of thing? And ended up finding the University of the West of England, which has pumped out a lot of people into our industry, and did the course back then was called Music Systems Engineering. And it was quite a good overview of all of the different fields that relate to the music industry, and was very engineering focused. And then from that, I got introduced to programming initially in C, and then later on, I call Maxim SP programming because it's just a different set of tools, but it is programming. We did that. And then I did a master's, which was effectively the same type of material afterwards. But because there's this whole chunk of work, which is your thesis, I sort of focused on programming for that. And that's where I found Juice, and then kind of got into, you can make basically anything with programming. So that was sort of my early introduction to it. Do you want me to carry on from there?
No, actually, I have a question regarding to this, because you started programming only at the university, so that's where you learned programming.
Yeah, it was a bit of a trial by fire, because I think when I was at school, programming wasn't as big a thing. Like, there weren't many schools doing programming.
Okay.
And I remember, just because of the way you normally have a lecture and like a practical session each week, but just because of the scheduling, we had our first practical session before the lecture. So it was like, okay, here's a compiler, build it, there'll be some errors, fix them, and then try and get a running program. And I was like, okay, what's a compiler? What's this language? It was in C. I was like, how the hell are we supposed to know what this random error message means? There was just no context at all. And then through the course of that year, you sort of start unpicking, okay, this is how the programming language works, and this is how computers work and things. So, really nothing before that. Okay,
and if I can comment on this, because I think there are like two schools of thought. One is exactly learn from ground up, start with C and learn all the basics around that. And the other is, okay, start with Python, which is kind of higher level language, and learn the programming concepts rather than, the tight integration between the code and the compiler. So do you have any approach on this? Do you think you benefited from learning C first?
I don't really think so, because after doing C for a couple of years, you very quickly get introduced to C++, and then you have to figure out all the ways that they're subtly different. So I would certainly say, if you're going to go that route, start with C++ now, which is what a few years later we ended up doing at university. But I think certainly today, unless you're going into an industry you're only going to use one language, and you really want to kind of have rock solid understanding of that, learning the principles of engineering, basically how to solve problems with the tools that you've got, and the blocks that make up pretty much all programming languages, if else, logic, loops, that kind of thing. Which is why I think, I think very young kids start learning Scratch now, which is like a visual way of programming, where you kind of like plug pieces together. Like, that is how I think programming probably should be taught, because it teaches it in a kind of fun and engaging way. And then on top of that, you're just building up the steps to solve problems. So, for example, it probably didn't matter what we did the early programming in, but later on in my career, when I'm doing, close to the architecture, real-time programming, that's when you need to know about that stuff. So, yeah, I think you can progressively learn it for sure.
Okay, nice. I totally understand this approach. And related to that, since you, I think, had a very specific course which was very strong, on music technology, which involved both signal processing and programming. And do you think that if someone wanted to be, an audio programmer today, to become an audio programmer today, or transition to this field, then you think the university route, is the mandatory one, or helpful one?
I certainly don't think it's mandatory. I liked it because I didn't go in knowing that I was going to do software development, and there were loads of people that could just find what they wanted. Like there was an acoustics module, and I know people that do, applied acoustics now and things like that. So if you know you want to work in that industry, but you want an introduction to lots of stuff, I would say that's really good. If you do, if you know you want to work in programming and do like a computer science degree, then you can probably learn enough about the musical side of things to transfer. I guess the area that probably lacks in our industry is people who are very music first and then pick up programming in a very perhaps non-structured way. You can especially with languages like C++, you can learn a lot of bad habits really quickly. And it would be nice if there was, some proper structure to it. And that has changed over the years. I think, back when I was doing it 10, 15 years ago, that was probably much more of the case. Whereas now there's some great books that are focused around programming for audio. So I think reading those and the huge amount of online material that just wasn't available back then is certainly a good way to start doing things professionally rather than just hacking forever.
Yeah, for sure. And I think around that time also C++11 adoption, I guess has just started. So I can imagine, a lot of very old school examples floating around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember when I was first doing C++, it wasn't C++11, I don't think. So you had to spell out all the iterators and things like that. And yeah, that's just not a very pleasant experience. I think learning modern C++, if you've got ranges and things, is going to be much nicer.
Exactly. And when we're talking about learning, I know that you've also done some teaching at the university. And could you share maybe what did you teach, and did it somehow then help you later on in your career, this teaching experience?
Yeah, so I ended up, as I was doing my master's, I ended up teaching on, the course evolved a bit, but it was the new introductory programming to with a view to audio. When I did it, it was about programming robots, but Tom Mitchell, who probably many people know, he created a course which was, he built like a server-based application that played sound in response to MIDI events. So you could get like this very simple main application and speak to this server and then control it like that. So you didn't have to know any of the audio side of things. It was more like, here's a program, here, create MIDI sequence, you need some notes and events and stuff like that. So that was a really good kind of way to introduce people to programming. And I kind of learned a lot doing that. In the second year, I taught on a module that I did actually take called, I think it was just called audio processing. That was building audio unit effects in C++ and then synthesis in Max MSP. And then I did another second year module called software development for audio, which was proper C++ using Juice and introduce you to threads and, GUI stuff and everything. So, quite a good range. And did it help me? I'd say, absolutely. And I still think this, whether you're teaching at university or giving talks or even going to like meetups and, having conversations, explaining what you do to people, explaining something that you think you know to somebody else really helps highlight all the areas that you don't know and helps you kind of figure out how you actually understand it so you can explain it to somebody else. And particularly when you have students that are submitting work and you're marking it or you're having to explain, no, that won't work for this reason. Like, yeah, I know it seems to work, but it's really brittle because it's not going to stand up if you change this to that. Like all of that kind of stuff is kind of invaluable, especially when you're dealing with something like C++.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for me, exactly, if I may plug this in, it was one of also the motivation, to start, the blog and the YouTube channel, because exactly if you want to learn something right, then just teach it. That's I think the highest level of understanding. And every time I think when I'm working on some materials and I think I know something, then I prove myself wrong because there are so many little things that are under the surface that I don't know. So I think it's a very practical advice that everyone can take with them.
And also it's you can end up hopefully being quite humble with that journey because a year later you might have found out the way you did it isn't the best way, or there's, and I'm not going to say wrong because sometimes you are just flat out wrong, but programming is always an evolving journey. There's either new things added to the language or new hardware to support, or there are just techniques that you kind of come across. And I think you have to be open to continuously learning. And I think that teaching mentality certainly helps you do that.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and what was your then road after the university?
So I did the Masters at university and was teaching for a bit on those courses I just mentioned. Then I left university still teaching for a year or two on those modules and working in bars around Bristol, which was good fun. And then I picked up a few kind of small bits of contract work. So some of it was kind of teaching some people how to do something. I did a little bit of contracting for Juice when it was just Jules back then. And some kind of proof of concept mock-ups for people. Then I went away traveling for a bit. And after about 6 months, I got an email from Jules saying, we're kind of restarting Tracktion as a company. And I've seen your open source code on the Juice forums, because for my thesis at university, I created a module called DAW Audio and released that open source. And he said, yeah, do you want to kind of come and work with us on Tracktion? So I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good opportunity. So I kind of cut my trip short, I flew back to the UK and started working on that. And I think that was about 11 years ago now. So yeah, I was doing some other bits and pieces, but very quickly kind of got rid of all of those and ended up working full time on Tracktion.
Let's pause here for a moment. I can spoil that the next question is going to mention the Juice C++ framework, which is closely related to Dave's duties at Tracktion. But before we continue, I'd like to explain what Juice is for those podcast listeners who are not familiar with it. Juice is an open source cross-platform C++ application development framework that makes it easy to create audio software as well as audio plugins and plugin hosts. You can write code once and build VST, AU, AUV3, AAX and LV2 plugins on Windows, macOS, iOS, Android and Linux, as well as embedded platforms. I've been successfully using Juice since 2018, both in my private and professional projects, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. I especially like how Juice makes it easy for beginners to jump right into creating audio plugins and applications without worrying about C++ quirks. Juice is used by the majority of the world's most important audio companies, but it is free for personal use and there's affordable pricing available for companies just starting out. Apart from the framework itself, Juice has an amazing community of users gathered in the Juice forum, which is a great resource to learn audio programming on its own. Most recently, the Juice team released the preview branch of Juice version 8, which contains many new features, including WebView plugin UIs, which is very exciting. To start using Juice now, go to juice.com, download Juice, and follow their Getting Started guide. I have also put the link to it in the description. Have fun creating audio apps and plugins. And now, back to the interview. Okay, awesome. I think it's a chance you don't want to miss when you get it, and I totally understand. So, could you maybe share a little bit of the history of Tracktion and what was meant under relaunching this?
So, Jules originally wrote Tracktion back possibly in '99. It was certainly around the 2000 mark, and he wrote the Tracktion DAW as it was then, and wrote Juice in order to facilitate building that. They were kind of two separate things, but they were always kind of developed side by side. Then I think he distributed it himself for a year or two and then sold Tracktion to Mackie, who worked on it for a number of years and distributed it for a bit longer. They had a few versions, and then Jules retained the Juice part and then built that out and licensed that for quite a long time. So what happened after, I think it must have been about 10 years or something, Mackie had it. I think the financial crisis hit and they sort of stopped investing into Tracktion. And Woody, who got to know Jules, he was working at Mackie, kind of said, we like this. You're just letting it languish. Can we kind of take it off your hands? You can still use it for your purposes, as OEM software, but we'll kind of renew it and, develop it. So he got together with Jules and another ex-Mackie person, Dave Christensen, and formed the new Tracktion company, which built the first version of Tracktion under Tracktion Corporation called Tracktion 4. And about 6 months after that was when Jules contacted me, and I kind of joined in and started working on Tracktion from there on. And now we work with Rowland, who was also working on Tracktion at Mackie because he worked for Mackie, but now he's a contractor. So yeah, it's still a kind of small team and as the same people for about 20 years now, but that's kind of how the company evolved.
Okay, and I understand that there was Tracktion, and then out of Tracktion kind of evolved Juice.
Yep.
But then, there's also these other companies like Prism Sound and SoundStacks, and how did they evolve? And what's the relation now between, this whole group of companies and Juice?
Okay, so when Jules retained Juice, that's when Juice becomes completely separate from kind of my role in these companies. So I'll come back to Juice a bit later, but about 5 years ago, we ended up buying Prism Sound and Sadie, which they were kind of packaged together, and to form an umbrella company, we created a company called Audio Squadron. So that's sort of not really used, but it's just a kind of parent company for Tracktion, Prism Sound, which does the hardware side of things, and Sadie. Juice went on to be acquired by Rowley, and Jules worked at Rowley for a long time. And then Juice got bought by Pace a few years ago. Lots of people probably know that. But Jules went to as an employee under, I don't know exactly all the details, so don't quote me on this, but he moved to basically the NI group and under SoundStack's division working on the C major language. Now Jules and Ches have just broken away or, departed harmoniously, no bad feelings or anything, but they're now working on C major under the, let me get it right because I did ask Jules earlier. The name of the company is C Major Software Limited. So C Major is developed under C Major Software Limited by Jules and Ches at the moment. Currently no legal ties to any of our other companies, except that Jules co-owns all of them. Juice is owned by Paste, completely separate, and Soundstack, as far as I know, is still part of NI, but what they're doing under that brand, I don't know at all. So, yeah, I don't know if that is slightly confusing, but
that's super confusing. But maybe one more question I have on this. So currently, Jules has no impact on Tracktion code base directly. Is that right?
Yeah, so sort of, although because he's still a company owner, he has actually been doing a little bit of work over the last month as they've kind of been managing this, setting up this new company. He's kind of dipped in and played on little bits and pieces, but essentially he's not really been involved day to day on the coding side of things for about 5 years or so. We still talk and, big architectural decisions and things like that we discuss, but his focus has been on other things day to day. But in terms of like what we own and work on, you can think of it as just the Waveform DAW, Tracktion engine, hardware's Prism Sound, and then the Sadie DAW, which is kind of separate, but that's what we own.
Okay, nice. And can you say roughly how many people work in the whole company and then at Tracktion?
Yeah, so it's easiest to do it kind of two things because the two don't really cross over that very much. So at Prism Sound, I think we've got about 12 to 15 people. It kind of goes up and down slightly as people come and go. Engineering team is about 4 or 5. And then there's sales, production, because it's hardware and things like that. So, again, still a relatively small company. Lots of hard work goes into making those big boxes. And then at Tracktion, again, we're probably at our kind of smallest that we've been over the years at the moment. So we have about 3 devs and then 3 people that work on product, support, web, that kind of thing. So, we output a lot. Everyone says we output a lot for such small companies, but it also means we can kind of keep focused and move around quite quickly, which is good.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'm also surprised, to see such huge output, with just 3, core developers. But I think it's also true that programming output does not scale linearly with the number of developers that are involved. So.
No, it doesn't. You end up in these very big kind of jumps where you kind of reach a point where like, okay, we need a developer, but you don't actually need a developer. You need 3 developers and an engineering manager to kind of manage the whole system. So yeah, it's kind of difficult getting to those tipping points. And also it becomes slightly less fun at that point because everything has to be kind of planned a bit more in advance. Yeah.
Okay, speaking of management, then could you maybe say what are your current duties in both the Audio Squadron and Tracktion?
Yeah, so I'm one of the owners of Tracktion and the Audio Squadron group. So there's kind of that side of things, and then it's very difficult to define because we're such small companies. You end up doing a bit of everything. But I guess my closest thing that people will know is I'm probably more like the CTO type person. So kind of overseeing all of our technology and roughly where it's going. But I work as an engineer on the Tracktion side of things. So that's where my coding happens. And then more of a sort of engineering manager on the Prism side of things. But they do a lot of hardware, which is stuff that I don't understand, so I just do my best.
Okay, nice. And I think it's still nice that, even if you're a little bit in a management position, you can still do some coding, which I believe a lot of software managers miss when they end up in this position.
Yeah, I've tried very hard to avoid being completely swamped with management stuff, and it goes up and down depending on what we're doing, but we're just preparing the release of Waveform 13 at the moment, so there's a lot of coding to be done, so I can do some.
Nice. So exactly when we're talking about code, and I think everyone knows that you work on the Tracktion engine and the Waveform DAW. And could you maybe explain what they are and what are the main features of these two products?
Okay, the main features is difficult because I saw you were going to ask me this question, and I looked up. I've literally just written a feature list for Waveform 13, and it's 8 pages long and has about 250 items in it.
Let's go.
So I think that's going to be quite boring for all your listeners, but if they want to see it, it will be on the website in a week or two. But essentially, Waveform is a fully featured DAW. It does pretty much everything you would expect a DAW to do: audio, MIDI, automation, all of that kind of stuff. And new in Waveform 13 is the kind of event-based clip launching workflow, so you can trigger clips and scenes in a less kind of predefined linear way. And Tracktion Engine is the backbone of that, essentially everything that isn't audio. Again, if you go to the Tracktion Engine repo, there's a features.md file there. It'll kind of tell you all the things that it takes care of. But the two big elements of it are, it's a data model to describe a DAW session. So it has things like clips, tracks, plugins, etc. And you manipulate that data model, and then it will internally build a playback graph and playback that graph in real time. So you can very quickly use it to build timeline-based applications, basically. So it's much higher level than something like Juice. And it also contains a whole ton of utilities to get all that done, but that's kind of the main difference, I would say. So think of Waveform as the GUI bit on top of Tracktion Engine.
Okay, and it's Waveform and Tracktion Engine are both open source, right?
Waveform isn't open source. We do have a free version, which is probably where that comes from. Tracktion Engine is open source, and we have a licensing model that's similar to Juice. So if you go to the repo, you can see that there. Okay,
nice. And I think it's maybe a unique opportunity to ask, because as you said publicly, there are not many DAWs out there. So I think it's always beneficial to be able to ask someone who is actually working on one, what are the main engineering challenges in a project of this scope? And maybe let's think of, Waveform plus the Tracktion Engine together and, as one huge conglomerate of code.
The simple answer is because it's difficult, and there's just so many features that you need to do in order to have any kind of parity with the others. I was talking about this with someone the other day, and there's literally probably hundreds of thousands of plugins in the world now, certainly tens of thousands. There's a new one every week. They just, there's lots of them. DAWs, you could probably name the common ones in a list of 10, and there's probably like 20 decent-ish ones that are usable in the world. So like those numbers are just vastly different. And the reason is because they're a lot more difficult to build than a plugin. A plugin, you get a nice encapsulated, here's your kind of small piece of UI and essentially your DSP hook, and there you go. Whereas a DAW is like, well, here's an infinite number of things that someone could do, and you have to handle an unknown number of tracks, playing back in real time, recording, inserting MIDI so it can be played back. You have plugin management. You have to deal with plugin delay compensation. There's automation. There's all different audio formats to deal with. There's just so much to get right. And if you get any of it wrong, it's essentially useless. So if you have a DAW that drops out a lot, you're not going to use it. If it glitches whilst recording, you're not going to use it. If it's not accurate or the plugin delay compensation doesn't work, you can't use it. So everything has to be spot on for you to be able to use it as a tool, basically. Oh, and the other thing is, the data model is insanely complicated. There's just so many different bits of kind of information, whereas you don't really have that in a plugin. It's like your one page is normally the best way of looking at it, whereas tracks, clips, automation, changing tempos, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I can imagine that then someone comes up with an idea that, hey, let's do, for example, an ARA plugins, right? And you need to support this, right, to stay competitive as a DAW.
Yeah.
And so you said that you're mostly 3 developers that work on it, but how are you able to organize your work so that you don't, run into each other, or that you don't break the features that you have already implemented, etc.?
So that third developer actually does all of our synth stuff. He doesn't do any Waveform or Tracktion stuff. So it's really just me and Rowland that do Waveform and Tracktion engine. But and I think because we're so few, it's actually easier, because also he's on a slightly different time zone to me. So we tend to do things kind of separately and then kind of commit them at different times. But because we're so small, we can generally talk to each other, and we also have different areas that we tend to work on. So he does a lot of the MIDI side of things, while I'll do a lot of the audio side of things. So having kind of slightly separated areas is good, but of course we cross over all the time. And then having good test coverage, I think, is pretty important, especially more and more. Our kind of test coverage is just growing all the time, because we had 0 tests back when we first took it over. And we have benchmarks, which I've spoken about in talks before, that kind of system. So I think using the tools certainly helps there. Get pull requests if we're unsure about something. We just kind of make it work.
Okay, thanks. And, in a project of this scope, I can imagine that also the pure notion of, software architecture is quite challenging. And my question to you is then, is there any, architectural pattern or design pattern, one of the ones that are well known in software engineering, that you found useful during working on Tracktion engine and Waveform?
So I don't think we're particularly tied to any specific patterns. I think most design patterns have their use. So, if something works particularly well, we'll use it. So for UI, for example, the builder pattern works quite nicely in places. I'd say the one big thing that we are quite tightly tied to is MVC-like. I say like because we use juice value trees, which kind of take care of the model and the controller element, and just provide a bunch of callbacks to deal with. So because our model is based on that, it's very much programming like you would with MVC, but with a bit less code to write. So that's probably the one that people, if you had to know one to be able to use Tracktion, then that would probably be the one.
Okay, nice. And nice that you mentioned Juice as well, because that's something I was wondering quite a bit. So, Tracktion code base really heavily relies on Juice. And I think also in the data model, it manifests itself. As you said, thanks to Juice value trees, you can write much less code and much more correct code at the same time. But at the same time, aren't you afraid of such a huge dependence on Juice? And have you thought, about shielding yourself from changes from Juice? How do you approach this?
I wouldn't say we're afraid of it at all. And I don't know, maybe that comes from its lineage, because Juice was developed, side by side by Tracktion from day one. So it just feels very natural that they work well together. It was originally created to fulfill all the needs that the DAW needs. Obviously, it's gone its own way, and there's a lot more stuff in Juice now. But if we didn't use Juice, we would have to write a whole bunch of stuff that would replace bits of what Juice does anyway. And it's actually probably not as big a dependency as most people think. Certainly on the waveform side, because it's all GUI, all our GUI is written in Juice. That would be a nightmare to write in something else. But in terms of Tracktion engine, we use Juice value tree heavily, but to be honest, the interface onto Juice value tree is quite small anyway. You could write something that looks similar and kind of replace it without too much effort. And the bit that we use Juice that saves us lots of time is plugin hosting and all the audio device management. So if you took those kind of three things away, we'd have to use something else for audio management and audio files and things like that. And what you're left with is really just the Juice containers. And to be honest, most of what we use there is historical because they were just in there. We could certainly use Stud Vector a lot more nowadays because it's better than it used to be, and other containers that are perhaps more suited. Like we have reference counted pointers to everything, the Juice ones, but making those shared pointer or even just having stronger ownership semantics would be fine. So I think it would be a chunk of work if Juice disappeared and we had to rewrite a bunch of stuff in Tracktion Engine, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would just be all the hard work that Juice does, managing all the OS updates and audio device changes and new plugin formats and things like that. That would be a real burden to take on. So yeah, I think it works well. And also they're a great team. Tracktion Engine is probably one of the few apps that uses almost everything Juice has to offer. I say almost because they're always adding stuff now, but it certainly exercises a lot of it. So we're a good test bed for Juice. And if we report things, then they get back to us and say, oh yeah, we can fix that or change that. So it still works similarly to how it used to.
Okay, nice. And have you ever run into such a situation that Juice changed one of their APIs and you had to make quite a bit of changes in your own code base?
Yeah, it happens periodically.
Okay.
I'd say the last, I can't even remember what it was now. I think it tends to be when they deprecate something for good reason. I think they deprecated Juice scoped pointer once, and we used that everywhere in our code base. So I think it took me about 4 days to go through and replace all of that with Stud unique pointer. And the only annoying thing is if it happens at a time when you're trying to release something, because then you're like, right, just stop everything while we update, because you happen to need a fix that comes from Juice that you can't cherry pick backwards, and kind of dealing with branches that have this kind of interleaved Juice history is a pain. So it doesn't happen that often, but it has done in the past. But I've always had the opinion that we take a similar approach to Tracktion Engine in that we're going to periodically break things if it gives a significant improvement in the user experience. So as long as there's reason for it, I think it's okay. But yeah, try and minimize those as I know Juice does. So.
Okay, I understand. Thanks. I have a kind of a different question now. So let's say you are starting work on a new feature of the Tracktion Engine. And do you, as a developer, have some established structured approach to the design and coding process of a particular feature?
So you're talking about Tracktion Engine. This isn't like a GUI level thing. This is
I would
more on
say
the software
so.
side of things.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, it varies a bit. Often what I do these days is I'll just write down the kind of requirements of a class or a feature or something that needs to happen, because I think that really helps kind of cement what you're going to do for this. If you don't have any, this is what I'm actually building here, set of rules, then you end up writing something going, that's actually not quite what I wanted to do. It doesn't fit the hole that I originally intended. So I tend to write those down first because it gives me a reference point. And more these days, I start with writing possibly some tests because I know it needs some functions, what the API needs to look like and what it should return. And that helps shape the bits and pieces. But sometimes, you just start writing class and see what comes out. So I think it depends, and it probably depends on how big an impact that is going to have. So when I rewrote the playback graph for Tracktion Engine a few years ago, and I wrote like the Tracktion node class, I spent a long time figuring out okay, how do I want people to write their own nodes? How do we want to interact with it? How do I make sure that API is, guaranteed to be used in the right way? Whereas for kind of smaller features, I don't think paying that much attention matters, because, it's going to be a continually developed.
Okay, I understand. And yeah, for sure, like something like Node, once you release it, it's very hard to change the operating principle of this.
Yeah, and it's good. So I have added things to it recently, mainly for optimization. And one of the principles that I wrote that class on was I wanted it to work without all of those optimizations for all of the use cases. And then you could kind of opt in to optimizations. And I haven't had to change the original API to do that. There's just kind of more customization points. And I think that's a good kind of validation of the original design, if you don't have to rewrite it constantly, the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. Another tool that you've worked on at Tracktion is Plugin DAW. And could you share a little bit, what is this tool and who is it for?
So Plugin DAW is a tool essentially for plugin developers, but could also be test teams and even end users if they're trying to diagnose some issues with their plugins. But it's essentially a stress tool for plugins. So it internally is a plugin host. It's just a little command line tool that you say, hey, run a bunch of tests on this plugin. And then it will do things like exercise all of the plugin API calls, including things like get a bus, attempt to set a bus, read the values of all your parameters, try and set them, those kind of things. Because a lot of the time we've seen in Waveform when people report, oh, there's an issue with this plugin, is because, reading the string value of parameter 120, which should be fine to do, but obviously no one actually does that in the real world. And it crashes the plugin. So I thought, well, we just need something to exercise all of this information. And so it does that, and then it does a bunch of more kind of fuzz type testing. So it will set your parameters randomly, restore the state, that kind of thing. So it should just be used as a validation tool for your plugins, basically.
Okay, nice. And is it easy to hook it into your CI pipelines?
Yeah, so there's two ways. You could either get the repo and build it yourself, or there's binaries available as just GitHub releases. So you can just download them from the URL, the static URL, unzip it and run your plugin there. We do that with our plugins at Tracktion. I know a lot of people do now. There's also a guide on the repo you can have a look at that will show you how to do that.
Okay, and there'll also be linked to it then in the episode notes. Okay, moving now from the precise description of certain features of Tracktion and its products, I wanted to ask you more now in regard to learning audio programming and your journey in it. Because you are widely regarded as a C++ real-time programming and software architecture expert, which I please don't deny this. And could you maybe share, what was your internal journey in this area and what helped you the most, which resources you found helpful along the way?
It's always difficult to kind of accept when someone says expert, because it depends who you speak to. You might be an expert in one group of people, and then you go to a conference or something and you're like, yeah, I am not the expert here. All these people know a lot more than I do. But I think that's fine. Everyone is constantly learning, and that's why it's still interesting, I think. In terms of developing and getting to that more expert, level, I would say probably the big jumps started happening when you do open up your kind of horizons a bit more. When I went to the first CPP con and had to sit through, it was a good opportunity to sit through a week of talks, and it really just kind of opens your eyes to how many good people there are programming in the world. I think if you don't do that, and it's probably easier with YouTube and the juice forums and stuff these days, and podcasts like yourself. But back then it was a bit kind of revelationary. You kind of end up programming thinking, do you know what? I'm a really good programmer. I'm probably like in the top 5% in the world or something like that. And then you go to CPPCon and there's 1,500 people there that are all miles better than you. And you go, okay, perhaps not. But that's good because there are 1,500 people you can learn from. So certainly going to conferences, and there's so much material online now that there's kind of not really any excuse. I still probably watch about at least a conference talk a week because I think, everyone's got those moments where their brain probably isn't being that productive. And you're like, okay, let me just watch this. Especially now you can watch them at 1.25 and 1.5 times. You can kind of get the gist. And that's good. I know it kind of sounds like how much can you take in at that speeds, but that was the same when you go to a conference. You're not understanding every word if you sat through like 30 in a week. It's more getting an idea of what's going on and then knowing that somebody said something important so you can go back to it later on. And that I do a lot. I'd say certainly expand your horizons in terms of industry. So I learned a lot from the finance industry because they do a lot of low latency things, different outcomes, but very similar set of problems, and also games. But, there's this stuff crops up all the time. So it's useful to just get a wide perspective on various industries. Then I'll say there's kind of a next level, which is actually giving talks and having, we talked about education and teaching earlier on. Giving a talk is a very nerve-wracking thing to do, but for me at least, I felt like I had to really know the subject area in order to be able to give a talk on it, which is kind of embarrassing because I look back on some talks that I've given in the past. I'm like, I just wouldn't do it like that anymore. Even Fabian, who I worked with in the Real-Time 101 talk, we worked hard on that. And he did a talk at ADC recently called his Real-Time Sins, Confessions of a Real-Time Software Developer, I think it was called, where he kind of said, yeah, I've kind of changed my mind on some of those things. Things are always changing. But I think you learn the most just through solving problems, right? Things crop up in day-to-day work and you have to get those problems fixed. So you have to find out how to do it. So just use all the tools around. And I guess the other thing is talking to people, particularly if you go to meetups or, just social events, that kind of thing. Just getting to know how other people have approached problems and solved them is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, for me, it's sometimes problematic to take this advice on solving problems on your own, because it's kind of this chicken and egg problem that you are often required to know something before you're hired for the job to solve the problem. But I think you just need to kind of use the opportunity where it pops up, and sometimes maybe work on a project on your own, make up a problem to solve. But I think it's very, very solid advice. And my personal take is that it may be a little bit intimidating if you and Fabian change your mind or you correct yourselves after time. It may be intimidating to people that, okay, how can I now learn this stuff? So because the experts make mistakes as well. But
yeah,
you know what I mean.
I think that's the important thing to learn is it's not about knowing the best solution. It's about having the right approach. So if someone, if we were hiring and someone hadn't solved all the problems that we were doing, then I don't think that would be a negative thing. It would be more, how do you tackle an unknown problem? Like, what's your approach to it? How are you going to find the information in order to solve it? And just being able to demonstrate that you've done that elsewhere, I think, is the important thing. Because it will always adapt. So a good example of this is Timor does a lot of work in the standard now and the C++ standards committee. And so he talks to a lot of people from different industries. He gave a talk a few years ago at ADC on read, copy, update, and he learned another tool called Seat Clock, which he's spoken about. I can't remember if it was at I can't remember which conference, but anyway, he showed that to me. He said, people in finance are using this a lot. And I was like, okay, I've never heard of that before, but it turns out it's used all over the place in the Linux kernel. It's just a tool that just never made it across to audio for some reason, but it's brilliant at doing a whole bunch of things that I need. So I wouldn't have known that before. Now it's a tool that I have. I've changed the way I would solve a bunch of problems in the past because I have a different tool. So, that's just the way things work.
Okay, awesome. Still in this area of learning, I think especially challenging in audio programming is this real-time programming. So where we must guarantee that the audio callback that we get from the operating system, from the audio device, will complete processing in a specified time in order not to glitch. And my question to you is, apart from your and Fabian's excellent talk on this topic, and I also know that Timur also lately gave a talk at CPP now, I think, which was called Low Latency C++. Are there any other resources that can allow C++ developers learn real-time programming?
There's a whole bunch of conference talks. If you listen to pretty much anything Fedor Pikas has given, he does a lot of the atomic side of things. There's a whole bunch of talks from the finance industry. I think David Gross has given some talks that I've certainly picked bits and pieces up from. It depends. There's also some more sort of researchy areas. I think it's a guy called Daniel Anderson has given a couple of talks at CPP Con about atomic shared pointers, and behind the hood they use things like read, copy, update and hazard pointers to solve the problems that have been spoken about in terms of shared pointer. So, all of these talks might talk about one specific thing, but it's really just getting a picture of the landscape so you know what tools you have at your disposal when you're trying to solve a problem. And I think that's where Fabian got the idea for that kind of decision tree that we presented in Real-Time 101, which was, think about your requirements and then there's probably a tool or a pattern applicable to it. And, that decision tree has probably grown quite a bit now because we've both learned a lot in the last few years. So, I think that's probably, it's difficult because you watch enough and then there's some good stuff. But I know there's some people on the Juice Forum that have like curated lists of talks that they find interesting. So perhaps, I don't know if we can find those and you can add them in the description. That'd be good as well.
Okay, I didn't know this. I need to look this up and also link to it. That's I think a very good resource. Okay, and I think so we talked architecture and design, we talked C++ programming, we talked real-time programming, and then the last thing is this high performance processing. So you are already on the audio thread. We disregard any communication that happens to it. You need to do processing, as fast as you can. And what are the programming techniques relevant to such processing?
Okay. I just remember one more thing on the real-time side,
Go ahead.
which I'll finish up my thoughts on that. The reason the real-time side of things is so hard is because it's essentially impossible to test, right? Most of the time, everything will work until occasionally you'll get a glitch. And unless you happen to be running a tool that has recorded what happened during that glitch, it's kind of gone forever. But I did see a talk at ADC last year by David Trevelyan and Ali Barker, who have created a tool called Radsan, which is a Clang sanitizer, which basically flags a bunch of known non-real-time safe library calls and will tell you when you've hit those. So if that can make its way into full Clang and Apple Clang maybe, then people can... That would be such a huge help just to know when they've done something wrong, because it's hard. You call something and it ends up under the hood taking a lock somewhere, and that's your problem, but you just never know it. So back onto like the single-threaded high performance side of things. I guess the easiest way to explain my approach to this is when I've talked about optimizing in the past and the kind of the various levels of optimizing, by far the best thing to do, and it's amazing how much this comes up, is to just try and not do some stuff, because over time code grows and it bloats and it does stuff that you don't need to anymore. If you can just sit down with a profiler and see where the time is spent in your program, half the time you can go, I just don't need to do that, or that doesn't need to happen all the time, and you can kind of just find better ways of doing things. You can, using a similar approach, find where hardware will do a better job for you. So vectorizing stuff. Nowadays, you've got huge vector units. If you can take advantage of those, you get essentially free speed ups. Bit of work around calling those functions, but everything should work the same way. And then the other one, which I've explored more recently, is to make a better use of CPUs in terms of avoiding cache misses and pipeline stalls, basically. And sometimes just reducing the memory footprint that you're using can help you there. If you're doing some DSP and you've got a very kind of small hot loop, this probably isn't going to matter so much, but where we deal with in huge graphs of thousands of nodes, trying to reduce the amount of memory you're using really does make a difference there. So, that kind of thing. And also, more recently, I've been doing some stuff on kind of pre-calculating small amounts of time into the future, because if you can do that on a background thread and then pass it to your main thread without, interruption, you can get a lot of wins there. So yeah, again, it's just your toolbox and using a profiler to figure out where you need to kind of tweak a bit.
Nice. I think it's a very, very solid advice, and then people can, go to these techniques and learn them if they need it for their particular scenario. And I know you've talked already about this, but is there anything you'd like to add? On you hit a problem, some roadblock, you're not sure about something, then where do you go to find answers?
Well, I'm quite lucky that I work in a team with some really good developers. So my first point of call is our Slack. So, either Rowland or Jules or Wolfram will come back with hopefully some answers. There's the Juice forum, although these days, because I know it gets so busy, I try and leave that for Juice issues that I know are specifically Juice issues. But then there's some great online communities like the Audio Programmer Discord, where you can kind of chat a bit more freely about stuff. So I'd say use those kind of platforms for just starting a conversation, because there's probably someone that solves something similar that can point you in the right direction.
Perfect. Thanks. Another thing that you are known to be very good at, apart from programming, is giving talks. And you've given a number of highly successful talks at the Audio Developer Conference. And could you maybe share, were you at the conference from the very beginning?
Yeah, so I went to the first Juice Summit. I think that was my first conference. Probably was. So when it was, I don't know, about 100 people or something in some tiny rooms down in East London. And yeah, I've been and spoken at every one since, luckily. So yeah, it's been interesting to see it grow from where it was.
And where do you get ideas for the talks?
So I've sort of inadvertently fallen into this pattern in the last sort of 6 years, where I give like a really technical talk, which has lots of code examples and involves quite like complicated reasoning and explanation. And then the next year I'll give a much kind of higher level talk. And I don't know why that is. It's probably because I just fear doing the technical talks every year. But my inspiration has always come from just the thing that I've spent the most time doing in the last year, basically. And I always give that advice to people when I say, you should do a talk. And they're like, oh, I don't know, what to speak on. It's like, well, look, you spend like 7 hours a day programming. You must be spending your time doing something, and you haven't quit your job. So you must find it vaguely interesting. what problem are you solving and what's the journey there? Because I bet you there's lots of people out there that would want to hear that journey and how you've kind of overcome those issues. So that's kind of what the approach I've taken to giving most talks is, just sharing the problem solving process that we've kind of done or that I've spent a lot of time on. Sometimes, the kind of higher level philosophical talks come through because I feel like they're messages that would be nice to get out there. But the technical ones, I guess, is probably what I'm most well known for.
Okay. And have you, suspected before giving your talks, on value trees, on real-time 101, on optimizing real-time C++ library, have you expected that they will become so widely cited and successful?
No, not at all. Okay. I think you're just lucky. I still think this, if I go to a room and some people turn up to listen to it, then that's always great to hear. But to know that there's still some talks, like the value tree one is interesting because people still use it as a kind of good example of how to work with value trees. And that's been watched like 10,000 times or something. And that's that's insane to think. But it's certainly nice. And I think it's nice if you can get a talk that does stand the test of time. And some of them just do. In the real-time 101 with Fabian's another example of it's just I think we just kind of really hit the nail on the head of a lot of people going, I wish there was, this talk. And I think that's why Fabian... So just a bit of background around the reason me and Fabian gave that together was he had submitted a talk to ADC about real-time programming, and he came up with basically Fabian came up with all the good stuff in that talk, the decision tree and stuff like that. And I had in my head a talk about how not to make a bunch of real-time mistakes. So the things that you can't use on the audio thread and all of that. And we both were speaking to Timur, who's, a mutual friend, and asking for feedback and stuff. And he said, oh, you two should talk to each other because it sounds like you're kind of giving almost the same talk. So we sat down together and we were like, we didn't have exactly the same idea, but certainly they were very close together, and actually giving one unified talk, it was probably the best thing. And I don't know from his perspective, but certainly I learned a lot just talking through problems. There'd be times where we'd go and meet up and talk about how we were going to, what pattern we would suggest for this solution. And then we'd just sit for an hour going, okay, could you do this, triple buffer into it? Oh, no, that's not going to work because then that is going to interfere with that. And, just working at a problem like engineers would. And I think what we came out with was a very kind of engineer focused talk, which is why I think it's kind of resonated with a lot of people, because it's this is the process we go through when we do it. But certainly I don't think we're expecting that many people to listen or watch it still to this day. So it's always nice.
Exactly. I think it's sometimes it's even funny, that every talk that I go to, it seems they're citing this talk, and it's really crazy, but it speaks of the fact how needed it was and is still needed today.
Yeah, it's funny. I sort of played on that in my last ADC talk because I managed to kind of quote myself in every talk that I've given in the past into it as a sort of joke. But it's all good fun.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should now start just putting a random slide. You just citing this talk completely out of context in every ADC talk. And yeah. And do you have any structured approach to preparing a talk?
Yes, but it's kind of different. I tend to start with a Google Doc, just like a text document, and I write down essentially a list of things that I want to cover. And that's just more like a brain dump. And then I'll kind of come back to that and I'll give it some more structure. And from that, I'll go, okay, I've got the rough narrative here, and perhaps the chapters if it's divided up into that. Then I'll start writing slides, and I'll do all the bullet points and things first. So I basically take the Word document and put it into slide form, and then I figure out where I might need an illustration or an animation if it particularly helps with that example. So I do that. And then one thing that I kind of vary, I know a lot of people just write the notes the morning of and then go and give the talk. I cannot work like that. So I typically rehearse my talks, particularly if they're technical, like at least 10 to 15 times. And during that process, the first couple of run-throughs, I'll write the presenter notes. And then I get to a point towards the end where I can basically just do it without thinking about it, just because I know it's properly in my brain at that point. I would say that, and I've said this before, don't rehearse your talk too close to the time that you give it, because what happens is, rather than going into that autopilot mode, you end up thinking, have I already said this? And it's actually, you did say it in your rehearsal, but then you go, no, I've already said that. And then you end up not saying all the important bits in your actual presentation. And then you're like, I finished like 15 minutes early. Why is that? So yeah, just be careful of that. So that's kind of my approach. Yeah. But I admit it's probably overkill. And it also depends what you're doing. Some talks weren't that well prepared for or rehearsed.
Maybe there's also always some room for a freestyle joke or something, because sometimes if it's not freestyle, then it may feel a little bit too forced.
Yeah, it's nice to have a slightly relaxed mode where you can have some jokes and things. But I have in the past inserted jokes and just hope that they land. And that's scary, because if you say a joke and you've got like 150 people and they just stare at you like that. Yeah.
Okay, and do you give these bullet points or these slides or do you give your rehearsed presentation to someone else for review?
I used to. So I used to when I lived in sort of Eastern London areas, and I guess there was a group of us, like Timur, when he was giving his first conference talks, and Fabian would kind of get together, and Jules, and give our presentations to each other and provide some feedback, but not in the past sort of 5 or 6 years. I mean, I moved out towards West London, so it's just a bit more difficult. And also I've become more comfortable with knowing what is, if I've got everything that I want to get across. Whereas I think back in the day, I was kind of saying, right, these are things that everybody knows, but does the narrative make sense? Is my presentation style okay? But those kind of things I think I've got better at, so they probably need less checking. But I would certainly say it really helps if you are new to conference speaking in just doing it in front of some other people, so you can see what it feels like, feel the timing, the pace, all of that kind of thing, and just getting some quick feedback, even if it's like nitpicky things like you say too much, that, which I'm certainly guilty of. Those kind of things are hugely beneficial, and they just really help kind of like put your presentation style up a bit.
Yeah, cool. I think if the listeners are also living near Fabian or Jules, I think that they should also call them up to review their technical talks. That would be nice.
I'm sure everyone's got friends that will know a bit in the area. So. Yeah, just anybody really. I have given a talk to my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and it was about, what was it? It was about multi-threading, I think. And she works in human resources and in the legal industry, so it's like that's not her area at all. But she sat through it, and it did help me, gain some confidence in speaking to other people, particularly as it's not her industry. I think it was like, okay, can I engage her enough to listen to me for an hour talk about this thing? And that's, it was worthwhile.
Yeah, I think it's a great piece of advice, and I'll also try to always, rehearse my talks, and it definitely decreases the degree of nervousness that appears once you're on the stage.
And if you really can't rehearse in front of someone, just record it. Do it yourself, record it, and listen to it back. You'll notice some things that you don't like about it.
Exactly. And speaking still of conferences, so which C++ related conferences have you been to and how they compare to ADC?
So I've been to CPPCon a few times. I've went to Meeting C++ where me and Fabian spoke. I went to CPP on C last year and just attended CPP Online last month, I think. And they're all very different. I say they're all very different to ADC. And the thing with ADC is you get people from everywhere, and not necessarily everyone is a programmer, and not necessarily everyone is a C++ programmer. So you just don't know who you're going to end up talking to about something. So it's very kind of cool on the social element. I personally often find myself at ADC talking to people having no idea what they actually do, because it's just an area that I have no experience in. Whereas at CPP conferences, actually, you've probably dabbled or hit some of the same problem areas. So it's weird that you can have more familiarity with what people are doing. But I think it's really good to go to both, because then you kind of get a nice variety. And they're all different experiences, you get different food, they're in different locations, different cities. It's just good to get out and I think being in a secluded space with a bunch of other developers is just a really nice way to spend some time, because you can go out for dinner, you're in your breaks with them, and you can talk a lot more than you would normally. Particularly now as I kind of live a bit further away and I've got a young daughter. So there's just not enough time to hang out with developers all the time.
Yeah, and also that nowadays work seems to have shifted to kind of, remote or home office environment, and it's even more difficult to talk to fellow developers because you're not living in a huge office or something. Definitely. And now let's move maybe a little bit out from the conference area, and I would like to ask maybe more some laid back questions. So one of them is, which I'm always interested in, then what is your tech stack while you're working? So which operating system are you working on? Which programming languages do you use? Which IDE and the tools?
So I pretty much exclusively work on the Mac, just because I'm so familiar with the operating system and the terminal side of things that it just feels like slow when I'm working on Windows. But that's just because it's my experience. I have always used Xcode until about 6 months ago, where I switched to C-Line, and I use C-Line pretty much exclusively now, and it's brilliant. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it solves a lot of the problems that I had with Xcode. So we're kind of CMake based now in C-Line. We kind of had to do that CMake switch in order to be able to use C-Line. Then CI wise, we have used Agile pipelines, but now we use GitHub Actions because it's just so easy and quick to set up. And there's loads of examples. So we use that. Anything else?
And with regard to programming languages, then is it something else than C++ as well?
So it's almost exclusively C++ unless I'm doing some scripting thing that I might do in Python or Bash, but pretty much all C++ these days, yeah.
Okay, and with regard to GitHub Actions, I wanted to ask how often, if I may, how often do you run the pipelines? Do you run them on every commit, on every branch, or on pull requests?
Yep, every commit on every branch, but they're batched. So, if you push 5 in a row, it will only build the last one.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would just stall the pipeline.
Nice. And with regard to C++, since you're working on a Mac, I was really surprised, to see that Apple Clang still doesn't support certain features of not C++23, but C++20. And I was curious to ask your take on this. Have you considered like switching to pure Clang on Mac or?
Yeah, more and more so recently. I feel C++ is moving so quickly now, and the things that they're introducing make a real difference to how you can write code. And for a long time, I sort of had this 5-year compatibility window in mind. So I'd be like, right, we have to be compatible with whatever was on the major operating systems 5 years ago. But there's so many good libraries that come out that are portable versions of newer C++ standards. Like we use Tartan Llama, Cybrand's expected library, Tristan Brindle's Nano Range we use, but he's got a new library called Flux, which is kind of a safer version of a Ranges implementation. There's like a whole bunch of libraries that are really useful. Magic Enum's another one. So they've kind of filled some of the holes where you don't get the best C++ coverage, and sometimes, you get newer C++ coverage. Lib format, I think I'm going to pull in this week because that's got some really cool stuff in it. But yeah, particularly with the open source stuff like Tracktion Engine, I don't think we can expect all of the customers to compile with their own naked Clang versions on the Mac. So we're kind of tied to that, which is one of the reasons we use these other libraries. But I have thought about using Clang and then just statically linking it into the binary so it works everywhere, which is what we do on Linux. But I just haven't bitten off that chunk of work. And I think there is some value in supporting Xcode, which is what the majority of people will be using. And because most of Tracktion Engine development is done via Waveform, it would be annoying if you write a load of stuff because it works in Clang, and then I do my GitHub push, and then suddenly it all fails because it's built with Xcode. So yeah, but I think Apple Clang is pulling in things a bit quicker these days, so hopefully they can continue that trend.
Okay, nice. And I think it's also very solid advice to then use these kind of replacement libraries. Also because since they're trying to be standard compatible, their APIs won't change, out of the blue.
Yeah, people like Cybrand, he proposed the papers for
exactly, yeah.
Expected and the monadic additions to optional and things like that. So if you use those libraries, same with lib format, they're not going to change, or if they do, it's just a case of changing the namespace or some slight wording, but the semantics are going to be the same. So I very much recommend people do that these days, because it just seems to be the way things are being developed in C++, rather than going down the TS side of things where you get like an experimental header, which is really good. Yeah. Okay,
and if you were starting a greenfield project right now, would you still use C++?
Yeah, I think so. Just purely from a selfish reason, that's what I know. I would be very slow if I had to learn all of Rust to start a program in, and I'd probably still get into a whole bunch of trouble, doing Rust programming. I think it depends on scale. If I was doing a tool or a little command line app, it would be nice to maybe write it in another language. I've done things like that in Python before because it's just the right tool for the job, like parsing files and spitting stuff out. But if it was a big application, I would probably still use C++. I would maybe do UI slightly differently. I'd be interested to look at like web UIs and see how well they scale, mainly because they might port to the web a bit more easily. So I would certainly look into that. If I was doing a plugin, maybe look at C major, that kind of thing. But certainly if I was writing what we're doing, again, I would use C++.
Okay, nice. And then when you're working, do you happen to use ChatGPT or any other, AI-based tool in your day-to-day programming? Especially that you're working with sometimes very complex code.
I do. I use ChatGPT basically instead of a search engine now. So particularly, like C-Line's a good example. I will just Google or ChatGPT in what I'm trying to do and see if it comes back with something sensible. And the thing I really like about ChatGPT is how it cites itself. So it says, here's a reply, which is like the summary of what it can find on the internet, and then the articles that it pointed to. So then you can go to those articles to kind of fact check ChatGPT. So I use it for that, which is really helpful. And then in terms of programming, I will ask it questions as if I'm asking, another developer, and kind of just get it to see what it kind of comes up with as if you were talking to someone else, and say, hey, I've got this idea, or what would, the container to do this kind of behavior look like, and things like that. So I think I use it more as a search, rubber ducking type exercise rather than here is a problem, solve it for me. The one exception to that is, so if I'm writing like bash scripts, it's really good at like synthesizing stuff for bash scripts. So like, or regex. So if you're saying, I want to iterate the files in a folder and replace, I was doing this the other day. I said I wanted to replace every capital letter that's preceded by a lowercase letter with an insert a space. Like that would just take me ages to figure out the regex and the sed commands to do that. Whereas after about 5 minutes of ChatGPT, and I had something that worked. So it's really good for stuff like that.
Nice. And while you're programming, do you listen to music, or do you prefer to program in silence?
I really struggle listening to music. I wish I could, but I don't know if it's the being in our industry where you're so attuned to music technicalities, or my kind of university where we were sort of like taught critical listening, but I just get too distracted by it. The only thing I occasionally listen to, and this is more if I happen to be working on my lap and my wife's watching the TV or something, I'll put on sounds of the rainforest, or something that just kind of blocks out the world a bit and isn't really listening to it. But even that I find a bit distracting. I like the most silence possible when I'm programming, which is annoying because it would be nice to listen to some music, but I've never been able to do it really. I know some people do; they find it like helps switch off, but I just can't do it. And from a practical perspective, if you're writing some code and you're running like an audio loop and you're trying to hear a click or a sine wave or some phasing or something, you're just doing that every couple of minutes. It's annoying to have to keep stopping your music and listening, or switch your headphones over or something. So it's just not very practical.
Yeah. Believe it or not.
Listen to music?
Yeah. So that's.
Do you listen to music when you're programming?
That's something also that's hard to answer. So I try not to, because I'm really, as you said, the deepest focus, comes with silence. And at some point, this music becomes distracting. So some part of your brain, while you're programming, tries to shut off the music that you're listening to. But I use it sometimes if I don't feel like it, I feel kind of tired. And then I say, okay, at least I'll get myself in the zone listening to music. That's some music that I like. Or maybe some music, that brings some deep focused memory. So one example of this, when I was at the university and we were doing some pretty low level C stuff with Unix operating systems, I tended to listen to a lot to the soundtrack from the Dunkirk movie, and also from Blade Runner 2049. And I think this was kind of, it's now somehow embedded in my psyche that, listening to this music puts me into focus mode. But then, when I'm already in the zone, I'll typically then switch it off because now it's annoying. I'm more, gravitating toward work. I'm invested in work. I don't need the music anymore.
Yeah, I did try listening to things like the Inception soundtrack a lot because I just really like the music. But I think I find myself just thinking about the film or the music too much, and then I just can't work. I'd say there's occasionally I really like drum and bass. So sometimes I'll listen to drum and bass as I'm getting ready or getting into the office or something. And as I'm just starting up, it will kind of still be on. But I just find it really fatiguing. Like if I'm trying to concentrate on something and the music's on, it just within about like a few minutes, I'm like, it's hurting too much.
Yeah. And in the extreme cases, when I'm really tired, but it's some like in afternoon or late afternoon, but I really need something get done, then I'll turn on some metal music for a bit to kind of wake me up. But again, it's it'll probably go on for a track or two, and then I'll just pause it and go back to the focused mode, so to say. Yeah, but it's a fascinating topic because I think that every developer in the audio space has their own, approach to this. That's why I like asking this question.
And there's some that just they sort of struggle without it because they're just everything that happens, a bird or something like that might be distracted, whereas the music they're in the zone. Yeah,
exactly. So from the conversation that we had, it seems that you have quite a lot on your plate. So you're coding the Tracktion engine, you're coding Waveform, but you're also talking to a business partner, you're managing the company, you're giving talks, you're attending conferences. So how do you organize and manage your time? And then how do you also keep the level of energy high? Especially that you mentioned also that you have a family, you have a young daughter. So what's your hack on this?
I mean, I don't know that I've got it right. I would say one thing I've learned over the past few years, like as I've become, longer in the tooth, is to just accept the fact that your energy levels for work kind of will come and go. And when you're really feeling into it and you're kind of buzzing about solving a problem, to just lean into that and, get some good work done, but then don't beat yourself up when you're having a bit of that kind of writer's block type moment. Just go, okay, we'll just kind of keep working at it and then it will loosen up again. And I think that's kind of true with life, is that there's always slightly different demands, and sometimes you'll find things a bit tougher, and then other times when it's not as tough and there's a bit of space, just take a minute to enjoy that. So that's what I tend to do. For us, that sort of happens around our release schedules. So through the winter leading up to Christmas, we kind of do all our feature releases for the next Waveform version. So it goes into beta typically before Christmas. And then after Christmas, we do all the kind of bug fixing, minor feature tweaks, and then we'll get all the promo material, normally demo it at NAMM and then release it sort of March, April time, which is what we're doing at the moment. So that's the really busy period, but that means the summer's slightly less busy. And I kind of like it like that because it means you can just enjoy the summer a bit more and not be so worked up all the time. But I think it's just a case of trying to fit everything in without burning out, which is hard. And I wouldn't say I've got it right. You just kind of have to pick enough things that are interesting enough to make you want to do them. I say every time I apply to speak at a conference, I do it because I get a free ticket basically. And because it's expensive otherwise. And I don't think I could justify asking for money from the company to go to a conference or take time off if I wasn't. I mean, I'm sure I could, but I would feel guilty personally. Whereas if I say I'm submitting a talk, it's great networking, then that's a slightly different way of justifying things to myself. And I know it is good for career and experience and everything, it just having your face seen by a bunch of other people that you can then, gives you a foot in the door, as it were, I think is, from a selfish perspective, certainly something that I've tried to do. But every time I do it, leading up to it, I think, why did I bother? Like, do I even want to go to this conference? I'm just spending like every spare minute, like coming out to my office at like 10 o'clock, because my office is at the bottom of the garden, like having to leave the house, walk through the rain to like rehearse my talk at 10 o'clock at night when you just want to go to bed. for the third time that day or something. So it's, yeah, I regret it until you actually go and then you get it out of the way, and actually it's a really nice feeling. So that's good. So yeah, with work stuff, just trying to fit it all in as best you can, I think, yeah, I mean, I wish I was better at it, because with the amount of things across the different companies, you just feel like you're dragged in all directions, but that's hard. In terms of kind of like switching off and recharging, I used to DJ drum and bass a lot, not in clubs or anything, just by myself, because I loved drum and bass when I was through uni, went to a lot of club nights and things. And I just really like the way that so I would like to create music, but because I work on a DAW, it's like too close to home. You start up and you play a loop and you're like, oh no, there's a bug there, or I didn't want to do it like that, or you start thinking of a feature, right? But because I don't work on DJ software, and DJing is live, it's in the moment, you can't, stop. I find that therapeutic, and it's also quite fast and high energy drum and bass. So I used to do that, but I haven't done that for a while since I had my daughter, because she takes up most of my spare time. But I've kind of replaced it with building work, which is a bit of a weird thing. But we had my daughter, and then I was like, when my wife was on maternity leave, it's so distracting to have a young child in the house. And we're quite lucky that we've got a garden where we live, and there's a space at the end that was like, I could build an office there. And also really lucky that we live in today's world where you can go on YouTube and learn pretty much everything you need to know about how to build a 15 square meter office in your back garden for a third of the price it would cost to get people to do it. But what I found was doing building projects is like coding in that it's engineering, right? You've got a whole bunch of design principles, some restrictions on environment and soil, and is it going to collapse, and is it going to be strong enough, and that kind of thing. And I found, doing material science research really interesting, and what can you make roofs out of? What are the trade-offs for all these different things? And so I found that whole process interesting and ended up building an office, and that took me about a year to do. And then I took the summer off, and then I was like, I need another project. So I started building a porch on the front of my house, because I thought, I haven't laid bricks yet, let's do that. So yeah, just doing bits and pieces, but I don't know, I've got another baby on the way in a month, so probably the building projects will have to go on hiatus for a bit.
Awesome. So I think we're all waiting for the next ADC talk on how to build your office.
I would love to give a talk on that. That would be much easier and fun to do than some technical C++. That's a good, I might submit that actually.
Okay, but then please remember who to credit, right?
I will, definitely, yeah. You heard it here first.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for all the knowledge you shared. Thank you for this interview. And my last question to you is, if someone wanted to contact you, where do you recommend they go?
I'm not really on much social media now. Probably LinkedIn is the best bet. If you introduce yourself with who you are and how you know me or have heard of me, that would be helpful, because otherwise I'll assume you're a kind of recruiter from somewhere in the world. Or the Juice Forum, or perhaps the Audio Programmer Discord. But I don't think that sends notifications unless you @ someone or something like that. So yeah, if I don't reply, I'm sorry, but yeah, hopefully you can get in contact one of those ways.
Okay, thanks a lot, and I wish you all the best for all your future endeavors.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's been a really good chat. Thanks.
All right, everyone, that was Dave Rowland, an audio programmer and an engineering manager from Audio Squadron. Thank you so much, Dave, for this awesome interview, and I hope it will become as monumental as your other talks. If you, dear listener, would like to check out the episode notes where I list all the people, places, and references mentioned in this podcast episode, then head over to dwolfsound.com/talk023. So it's dwolfsound.com/talk023. And if you enjoy the podcast, if you benefit from the podcast, please consider subscribing to the WolfSound channel on YouTube and giving a thumbs up to this video there, then leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, up to 5-star review. And then please suggest in the comments on YouTube who would you like to see on the next podcast episode as the interviewed guest. Finally, don't forget about your free resource, the Audio Plugin Developer Checklist at thewolfsound.com/checklist, where you can simply tick off as you go through your audio programming learning journey what you have already learned. And finally, thank you for listening and see you in the next one. Take care.